Hi, everyone. My name's Julie Sheets. I work in the Office of Multi-Faith Ministry within the Office for Mission and Ministry, of which the Center for Peace and Justice is a part. And so on behalf of the Center for Peace and Justice Education, just want to welcome you to this final session of the day of Freedom School. I hope you've had a chance to take part in as many as possible of the events today. It's been a rich opportunity for learning and challenge, and I know having been a part of all 4 sessions in different rooms, I'm going home today with a lot to think about. So you noticed the wonderful snacks and food on your way in, so please enjoy that on your way out as well, and feel free to linger and visit after this session. We're privileged this afternoon to hear from Dr. Lowell Gustafson, who will be looking at the work of a really important scholar, Ta-Nehisi Coates, as he looks at kind of the connection between the civil rights movement and the current situation in Israel, the U.S. Context of response, and other kind of challenging places around the world. So we look forward to what you'll share with us today, and thank you so much for leading us.
Thank you, Julie, and many thanks to Catherine Gaddix-Oltis and all the organizers of Freedom School. I really appreciate all the work that they've been putting into this. And thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest and concern in this really tough, interesting, complex topic. So we'll try to work through this a little bit as best as we can. Obviously, the source of the idea of this is just when I and a lot of other people have read the message, which is a gripping account that this major American intellectual has shared with us. So that's what we want to be talking about. And let's see if I can get this to work. First, I want to just let him speak in his own words. So I want to give you a 9-minute video, but I think it's worthwhile. First, he'll be introduced at a panel that he gave up in New York, and then he will have a discussion on CBS Morning with primarily a Jewish interviewer whose family lives in Israel. So Ta-Nehisi Coates will start out talking about his ancestors and what he's remembered, how he's been formed by their legacies, who needs to be heard, who's not being heard now, and how he brings his own experiences to bear on this topic. But in this conversation with Tony DeCouple, who's his primary interviewer, you have a different set of ancestors, a different set of teachings that come out of that, and a different set of experiences. And so just think about these really 2 great traditions in conversation with each other, struggling to understand each other, and it's not easy. The other thing I would ask you to keep in mind is we're going to be watching this dialogue. I mean, when we talk about, what is Ta-Nehisi Coates' message to Israel, you're talking about the African American, Black American, and Jewish, this conversation about that. Israel is a Jewish state. So, and we are watching that conversation here at Villanova. Each of us has our own ancestors, and we have our own teachings that we draw from them. We have our own experiences. We're all here at Villanova University, which asks us to think seriously about veritas. What's as true as we can know it now about controversial topics like this? And how do we get to what's as true as we can know it now? Villanova Villanova's model asks us to practice unitas, unity, seeking to synthesize, integrate different truths, and we're going to hear different truths about that. How do we put them together, and what motivates us to do this? You're here because you have a concern, you care about this issue. That's ultimately I think the greatest of the three words that are Villanova's model of caritas, caring about a topic and caring for the people who are so profoundly influenced by the topic, other people and ourselves. So that's what I would like you to keep in mind as we listen to this beginning, and let me see if I can figure out how to make this work.
Good afternoon, beloved community, and welcome to the Riverside Church in the city of New York. I am the Reverend Adrienne Thorne, Riverside's 8th senior minister. We are grateful and honored to gather today in community and to welcome our wonderful group of speakers on stage. For so many of us, this is a difficult and painful time in our world. The Palestine Festival of Literature has been programming events internationally over this past year, bringing writers and artists to work together against the occupation and the genocide in Palestine. It is Riverside Church's heart work to push for love and justice. And it is our great privilege to have as our host this evening the highly regarded writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Mr. Coates will be moderating 2 conversations about Palestine and America's role in the ongoing injustices against its people. Please join me in welcoming him and our other esteemed speakers to the stage.
When I think about being here, I think about ancestors. And I think it would be wrong if we didn't proceed without acknowledging that. First of all, I was informed when I came here that this is where Edward Said's funeral was. And so it's incredibly appropriate to be here in this moment. The second thing is something that Yasmin and I talked about and have been talking about for a year, even when we did the other event before, was the fact that this was also the place where Martin Luther King stood up against the Vietnam War and was so courageous. And I want to acknowledge that in his time when he did that, a lot of people did not applaud. I want to acknowledge that there were many people who he thought of as his allies who left him. Yes. That's why I think it's very appropriate, right?
Absolutely.
Who urged him to be silent as bombs were being dropped on helpless people. And he did not do that. And so I think in that spirit, that's the spirit in which we proceed in our conversation.
Yes.
Our next guest is the acclaimed New York Times best-selling author Ta-Nehisi Coates. His new book, The Message, is a trio of interconnected essays that examine how the stories we tell or avoid telling can shape and even distort our reality. In the book, Coates reflects on his emotional first trip to Africa to visit Dakar, Senegal. Then he takes readers to Columbia, South Carolina, where he reports on the attempted banning of one of his books on race. And finally, Coates travels to the Middle East to witness the Israeli-Palestinian conflict firsthand. Ta-Nehisi Coates, good morning. How you doing?
Thanks for having me. Good morning, guys.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. You say that this book is written specifically for writers, stating that the task for young writers should be nothing less than changing the world. Why do you feel like writers should bear that responsibility?
Saving the world. Saving the world. Just to be really specific. Writing is how we interpret so much of everything that is around us. The Message is a political book. It argues that much of our politics actually happens before we walk into a voting booth, that our choices around us, that who we believe is human, who we don't believe is human, what policies we believe should be in the world, which policies we don't, are actually shaped largely by writing and the stories we tell. And so I believe that writers, and particularly young writers, have so much to do in the politics and in this time when, you know, obviously we have so much conflict and there's so many quote-unquote issues to be dealt with.
Ta-Nehisi, I want to dive into the Israel-Palestine section of the book. It's the largest section of the book. And I have to say, when I read the book, I imagine if I took your name out of it, took away the awards and the acclaim, took the cover off the book, the publishing house goes away, the content of that section would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. And so then I found myself wondering, why does Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I've known for a long time, read his work for a long time, very talented, smart guy, leave out so much? Why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why leave out that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and the second intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel, in any condition, has a right to exist?
Well, I would say the perspective that you just outlined, there is no shortage of that perspective in American media. That's the first thing I would say. I am most concerned always with those who don't have a voice, with those who don't have the ability to talk. I have asked repeatedly in my interviews whether there is a single network, mainstream organization in America with a Palestinian American bureau chief or correspondent who actually has a voice to articulate their part of the world. I've been a reporter for 20 years. The reporters of those who believe more sympathetically about Israel and its right to exist don't have a problem getting their voice out. But what I saw in Palestine, what I saw on the West Bank, what I saw in Haifa in Israel, what I saw in the South Hebron Hills, those were the stories that I have not heard. And those were the stories that I was most occupied with. I wrote a 260-page book. It is not a treatise on the entirety of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
But if you were to read this book, you would be left wondering, why does any of Israel exist? What a horrific place, committing horrific acts on a daily basis. So I think the question is central and key. If Israel has a right to exist, and if your answer is no, then I guess the question becomes, why do the Palestinians have a right to exist? Why do 20 different Muslim countries have a right to exist?
My answer is that no country in this world establishes its ability to exist through rights. Countries establish their ability to exist through force, as America did. And so I think this question of right to Israel does exist. It's a fact. The question of its right is not a question that I would be faced with any other country.
But you write a book that delegitimizes the pillars of Israel. It seems like an effort to topple the whole building of it. So I come back to the question, and it's what I struggled with throughout this book. What is it that so particularly offends you about the existence of a Jewish state that is a Jewish safe place and not any of the other states out there?
There's nothing that offends me about a Jewish state. I am offended by the idea of states built on ethnocracy, no matter where they are.
Muslim included.
I would not want a state where any group of people laid down their citizenship rights based on ethnicity. The country of Israel is a state in which half the population exists on one tier of citizenship, and everybody else that's ruled by Israelis exists on another tier, including Palestinian Israeli citizens. The only people that exist on that first tier are Israeli Jews. Why do we support that? Why is that okay? I'm the child of Jim Crow. I'm the child of people that were born into a country where that was exactly the case, of American apartheid. I walk over there and I walk through the occupied territories and I walk down the street in Hebron, and a guy says to me, I can't walk down the street unless I profess my religion. I'm with another pastor. No. I want to. This is very, very important.
It is important. It is
extremely important.
Yeah, let me lay it down.
I'm working with the person that is guiding me is a Palestinian whose father, whose grandfather and grandmother was born in this town. And I have more freedom to walk than he does. He can't ride on certain roads. He can't get water in the same way that Israeli citizens who live less than a mile away from him can.
And why
is that okay?
Why is that? Why is there no agency in this book for the Palestinians? They exist in your narrative merely as victims of the Israelis, as though they were not offered peace at any juncture, as though they don't have a stake in this as well. What is their role in the lack of a Palestinian
I have a
state?
very, very, very moral compass about this. And again, perhaps it's because of my ancestry. Either apartheid is right or it's wrong. It's really, really simple. Either what I saw was right or it's wrong. I am, for instance, against the death penalty. What the person did to get the death penalty, it really doesn't matter to me. I don't care if they were selling a nickel bag of marijuana or if they were a serial killer. I am against the death penalty. I am against a state that discriminates against people on the basis of ethnicity. I'm against that. There is nothing the Palestinians could do that would make that okay for me. My book is not based on the hyper-morality
What's the last
of the
message you
Palestinian
want
people.
in lessons? Because many people feel it's complicated. You say it's not complicated. Less than 20 seconds. What's your message?
Less than 20 seconds. I want people to read the book.
Well,
And I don't make the assumption that somebody would just read the book and have read nothing else about Israel
Okay.
and Palestine.
You're still invited to High Holidays. I'll see you at the show.
Ta-Nehisi,
I mean
so
it, buddy.
much. That'll do it for us.
Thank you.
Okay, now I have to get back to my PowerPoint. Who knows how that'll work? Yeah, how about that? All right, so that was a pretty intense discussion, right? You've got two traditions, two sets of ancestries, two sets of experiences in conversation with each other as we, with our own ancestries, are listening and filtering that conversation. That's what makes this topic so difficult to hear. And of course, for Tony Tokopoulos, the Jewish interviewer's tradition, there's so much in his tradition. I mean, pick out your names. The Moses and the Exodus story is a classic one to be using that. What's celebrated at Passover? It's the liberation of the Hebrew people who are slaves in Egypt, and the celebration, a remembrance of the freedom which they are given at that point, and then being granted a land, a place flowing with milk and honey, which didn't mean it was a sticky mess. It meant that this was a place of abundance, and that they would go from slavery to freedom and dignity and a life of abundance. This is something to celebrate, and that's what's coming. As opposed to the book of Exodus starts out with Pharaoh, and it tells us that the Pharaoh, this is actually 400 years after Joseph, but the Hebrews remember their ancestors. It says that the Pharaoh doesn't remember Joseph, and he didn't remember Joseph's Lord. The Jews remember their ancestors. The problem with the Pharaoh was he had forgotten. He couldn't be grateful for what Joseph had done for the previous Pharaoh. So remembrance of the ancestors is really important. That's a long time ago. I mean, Judaism is a really old religion. Christianity's old, a couple thousand years. I mean, Judaism is what, 3,000-4,000 years. And you've had an intense series of debates and discussions within the Jewish tradition about what is Judaism, what does it mean to be Jewish, who's Jewish. There are real significant discussions about that here, and how do we interpret key stories such as the Moses story or the Exodus story. You've got the traditional view of Judaism is about religion. It's about monotheism. It's their understanding of God. That's a good one. It's a source of ethics, a source of being kind to the alien in our midst and treating those justly. It's a call to be a blessing to the nations. The mission is to help heal the world. Or you've got more recent ones, not that Spinoza is recent, he's some centuries ago, but he's talking about, he's got a notion of Jewish naturalism, that nature is God. God is not the personal, ethical person that we often think of. It's nature that's God. Or we have a Jewish enlightenment, which emphasizes, like the rest of the Enlightenment, rationalism and liberalism and inquiry and so on. Or we have this idea of Jewish nationalism. Judaism is about a nation, and now it gets linked to a modern nation state. So Israel is a Jewish state that was founded in 1948. This is not 3,000 years ago. This is less than a century ago, and it fits into the whole world of international relations. And you have a whole range of ideas about what Judaism is. Is it about God? Is it about belief in God, or is it about practicing a way of life? Is it really commitment to a nation, to a state? And that you have Jewish atheists who say, that's old stuff, all of that religion stuff, but they're really supportive of Israel. So it's a complex topic to talk about. And then, of course, the whole issue of Christianity coming out of Judaism. But in any case, you have this notion of the Exodus story being about liberation, but not just liberation for one ethnic group. This is the idea about blessing for the nation or for heal the world, a care about the liberation of all peoples. And so when you look at the civil rights movement, there's lots of Jewish persons and Jewish organizations who are very involved in the American civil rights movement. They're not trying to liberate Jews, they're trying to liberate African Americans and the American Jewish Congress, and lots of others. Examples were of this. In other words, this is a universal message that they have. It's not an ethnographic message that they have. But once you linked Judaism with the state, and that's the definition, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state, then you've got all of the contemporary problems that all states have. And you've got to worry about security. That's one of the first things that states are concerned about is providing security. National security is a major issue. All of a sudden, if you're going to support a Jewish state, you've got to think about what's going to provide for the security of that state. And it can be kind of a dangerous world sometimes. To what degree do we start to focus on those questions of whatever security means? This is a movie, I don't know if you've seen it or not, it focuses on a couple of relatively young, everybody looks young to me now, a couple of relatively young Jewish Americans who are very critical of the idea of Zionism, or what they call Israelism. And their accusation is that Judaism has kind of gone off the rails a little bit, or at least some have, to the degree that it emphasizes almost exclusively a concern with this modern state of Israel, that all of the threats, as Tony DeCouple talked about, Israel being surrounded by hostile nations, that's where the focus is. It could be a victim, but by turning Judaism into Zionism or Israelism, it's transformed it, and so you have a Jewish critique of Zionism, of the formation of the state of Israel, or you have various Jewish groups such as the Jewish Voice for Peace. Which is one of the Jewish groups which says, which sort of agrees with the movie Israelism, that we don't worship Israel. In fact, we find Judaism to be about a universal ethical or religious or way of life that incorporates a concern for all peoples. So they are critical of Israel and say that we have to return to a more religious, ethical interpretation of Judaism. Now, the American Jewish Committee, which you remember was very supportive of civil rights, says the Jewish Voice for Peace is a minority. This is a small percentage of American Jews. Most American Jews are not hostile or critical to Israel. But again, you have some examples, important examples. Another author, in addition to Ta-Nehisi Coates, you have a Jewish author, Naomi Klein, who was out doing a Seder in the streets here at the last Passover. You can look at her speech on the internet if you're interested. And she talks about the contemporary meaning of the Passover, this this classic definition about what the Exodus Moses story is all about. And she drew parallels to that story with the current condition. And she says that what we are now worshiping is the false idol of Zionism. It's a false idol that takes our most profound biblical stories of justice and emancipation from slavery, the story of the Passover itself, and turns them into brutalist weapons of colonial land theft, roadmaps for ethnic cleansing, and genocide. Those are pretty tough words coming from a Jewish author. But is she representative of the wider Jewish community? But there's gotten to be a kind of a split among some American Jews and some Israeli Jews. Anyway, you've got the whole issue of Judaism. Then what is Christianity? Christianity is rooted in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish experience. And so we have the Catholic tradition deals with examining and studying the Bible and tradition and reason and experience, but it draws on these same stories. And again, how many times have we heard one of the major Catholic interpretations of the Exodus story, which is that God is one of those places where God makes a preferential option for the poor and the oppressed. That's what the story of the Exodus, that's what is the story that Moses is bringing to us. And this is something that we need to bring to bear, because this is a story for all people, not just for the Jewish state, not just for one people, but this is what Christians can take out of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Because of that, he uses that story, the Pope does, to criticize Israel. And so on November 17th here, a few months ago, he called for an investigation to determine if Israel's attacks on Gaza constitute genocide. He didn't say that he thought it was genocide, but it was serious enough that he thinks that's what we need to look at, because God is on the side of the oppressed and the suffering, and that's the people in Gaza. He says that Israel's attacks in Gaza and Lebanon have been immoral, and that the Israeli military had gone beyond the laws of war. Or the creche, the nativity scene that was at the Vatican. This is a fascinating picture. Here's the Pope looking at the classic nativity scene. And what does it tell you that baby Jesus is lying on a keffiyeh? That's sort of the national symbol of the Palestinians. Now, some Palestinians are Christian, some are Catholic. The majority are Muslim. I would draw from this picture, this version of the nativity scene, that Jesus has not come to save and convert the Muslims. He's born into them. He's identifying with them. He's exemplifying that notion that God so loved the world, all the people of the world, not just people who profess one particular set of beliefs or are a member of any particular institution. This is a universalist interpretation of the story of the nativity. And he said that on January 9th here, just some weeks ago, that the Israeli military campaign is serious and shameful, and that he says we cannot in any way accept the bombing of civilians. We cannot accept that children are freezing to death because hospitals have been destroyed or a country's energy network has been hit. These are pretty direct statements from the Pope about Israel. We have the somewhat more, we've got the Catholic tradition going back 2 millennia. Then we've got some Protestant traditions of which Martin Luther King was a part, of course, a minister in the Baptist one, which is a much more recent than either Judaism or Catholicism. But Martin Luther King, too, talks about the ancestors and the texts that the ancestors gives us. He's going to give you a short clip. He's going to talk about the importance of the basic American documents, Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, one of the ancestors, or the Constitution, inspired so much by the work of James Madison. These are our American ancestors, and these are the texts. What should we draw from them? And he talks about the Exodus story, the Moses story here in this speech. This is a speech that he made in Memphis the night before he was assassinated. And this, you remember that the Exodus story for Moses ends at Mount Nebo. That's Moses looking into the promised land. He never gets into the promised land, but he gets to the point where he can look with his people into the promised land. It's a story of promise, of hope. And that's what Martin Luther King takes out of this. So let me just show you a brief video of that. And I'm sure you've seen.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So Martin Luther King is Moses. He's standing on Mount Nebo. He never gets into the promised land, but he sees the promise, and he sees where his people are to go. It's a marvelous drawing. So we have the drawing on the Moses, the Exodus story. It's about freedom, about liberation. It's about dignity and living a life of abundance. It's about promise and hope, not just for one people, but this is a universal message. Martin Luther King is not Jewish, but he is drawing on the Hebrew Bible, and he's learning from that and incorporating that into his own tradition. So there we are. We have other interpretations of the Exodus story. And among them are the Christian Zionists. And it's important to remember there are probably more Christian Zionists than there are Jewish Zionists. In fact, Elon Pape, in his recent book, makes the argument that really the idea of a Jewish state is rooted in Christian Zionism before it was taken by Theodor Herzl and others founders of Jewish Zionism. But the Christian Zionists, first of all, they emphasize, like Luther, who talked about sola scriptura, if it had to be written in the Bible if it was going to be true. And the Bible is not just written by a bunch of people over centuries, it's the Word of God. It all fits together. It's a coherent message. And what is that message about? Here's John Hagee, who's the head of a group called Christians United for Israel. And they say, we have to read the Hebrew Bible because that's part of the Christian Bible. We can't separate them. We have to integrate all of them. And so let's read Genesis here, 12:2. This is the Lord saying, I will make you, your descendants, Abraham, into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, first of all, is this phrase talking about a nation state? Is a nation a people, or is it a state? This is a classic distinction that's made. And what does it mean to bless them? Does it mean to provide aid and diplomatic support? Or does it mean to call on them to relive the roots of their ancestry? But in any case, John Hagee says that it's the obligation of Christians to support Israel. This is how he interprets that message. He's the one who gave the benediction at the relocation of the U.S. Embassy under the Trump 1 administration when it was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And he says we have to support Israel. And what else does Genesis say? It talks about the promised land, Genesis 15. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, before he changes his name to Abraham, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. That's an interesting one. First of all, it gives somewhat specific boundaries for the land, which goes from the Red Sea into Iraq, into Syria, and into Saudi Arabia. That's what the Lord says in Genesis. Also, look at the second part of the verse. It's populated by a bunch of people. There's all the Hebrews under Joshua are not entering vacant land. This is not res nullius. This is highly occupied land. It's just irrelevant. There's classic critique of Israel now that it's a settler colonial society, and usually the claim is that indigenous people have a right to land, and that after you've lived in a land for centuries, as the Palestinians had, maybe they weren't exactly the first people who ever lived there, but at some point you gained that, and Jews started to arrive in significant numbers in the 19th century and in the 20th century. So the claim was they're colonial settlers, so they don't have a right to the land. But if you assume that this is the word of God, it doesn't matter. So the people who are there need to get out of the way. Apparently, our incoming representative of the United States to the United Nations, Elise Stefanik, testified before Congress 2 days ago. And there she said that Israel has a biblical right to the entire West Bank. That's Judea and Samaria, she said. So there's also talk about a two-state solution, which usually means the West Bank and Gaza somehow. She says, no, this is land that belongs to Israel. God promised this land to them. So these are not just 2,000-year-old. What do we learn from the ancestors, from the texts that they've given us? These are not easy questions to figure out. Ben-Gvir, who until very recently was the national security minister, he just quit because he doesn't like the ceasefire agreement. But he basically was saying we need to encourage emigration of the Gazans from Gaza. We need them to leave. This is ethnic cleansing. The land of Israel is ours, he declared, and Gaza's part of Israel. It was part of the Promised Land. Well, that's a religious kind of, well, the reading of what the text means. Or what's necessary? You had the Passover for the sake of the liberation of slaves, but what was necessary? What did God have to do in order to achieve the liberation of his people? And is it consistent with what again, recently fired Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said 2 days after the October 7th Hamas attack? He says, I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. And Israel has sort of followed his statement, and that he's just come to visit Washington officials a couple of weeks ago. Well, again, if you read the text, you can say, well, doesn't Gallant have an interpretation of these stories of the ancestors which supports him? You read about the plagues. God turns the water of the Nile into blood, and all the fish will die, the river will stink, the Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. Well, Israel's been a little bit more gracious than God was. They've let in a little bit of water, but not very much. But there's that. There's the terrible plague on your livestock. You kill all of the livestock of the Egyptians. You have festering boils that would break out on the people. Medical problems. They didn't have hospitals, but you could have bombed hospitals. You send hail to beat down everything growing in the fields, and then you send locusts, which devour all that was left after the hail. There was nothing growing in the field after this. Nothing green remained of tree or plant in all of the land of Egypt. This is economic. This is warfare. That's what God did. Gallant is saying there's a harsh interpretation of the Exodus story, and then it gets worse. God struck down the oldest son in Egypt, all the male animals. Someone in Egypt's house, except for those he passed over, died in every home. There's a question about how many thousands of children have been killed in the recent war assault on Gaza, but it's many thousands of children. Well, you could read the text and say, well, that's what God did. Then he also killed the charioteers and so on. So, and then you get into the Promised Land. After the Exodus story, you have the conquest of Canaan story, where the Lord commanded Moses to tell his people that they should slay every male. And the people of Israel took captive the women of Midian and their little ones, and they took his booty, all their cattle, their flocks, and all their goods, all their cities they burnt with fire. And the Lord had Moses tell the Hebrews, kill every male among the little ones, kill every woman who has known man by lying with him, but all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. And then there's also instructions of how you should divvy up the booty so that everyone, including the priest Eleazar on behalf of the Lord, should get their cut of the booty. Thou shalt kill and thou shalt steal. What's the teachings here? These are pretty harsh documents, but you can read these things. Some people read them and they say, that's what we have to do. We waited for 2,000 years to God do it again. They never did, so we have to do that. And so in 1 Samuel, the Lord Almighty says, go and attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Prime Minister Netanyahu quoted that verse. And he basically says that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, need to remember that verse. He says, you must remember what Amalek has done, says our Holy Bible, and we do remember, Netanyahu said. So we have the story of Joshua utterly destroying the Amalekites, and we have the stories of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, pretty much pulverizing Gaza. But how do we interpret? What do we leave behind? These are not just academic questions. They have policy implications. Now, more recently, rather than talking about biblical times, we've had this more recent case. This is the issue of what's necessary to establish the state of Israel, where you had lots of Palestinians living there. Now, Golda Meir was famous for the phrase that this was a land without people for a people without land. Except it wasn't a land without people unless you say the Palestinians aren't people. Willa Cather said sort of something similar. She's a famous American author, and you remember that when she was making reference to the American conquest, perhaps genocide, takeover of land here, she sort of dismissed it by saying there were no people there were just Indians. So that's a little bit of the attitude that Golda Meir had. To found the state, you had to drive those non-people out. And so about 700,000 Palestinians in 1947-48 were driven out of Palestine, out of what is now Israel. 200,000 of them were driven into Gaza. That was in 1948. Then Israel captured Gaza and has occupied it since 1967. They were setting up settlements there. They did withdraw that for a period of time, but they blockaded it. And a lot of people say that Gaza became sort of this open-air prison. You couldn't leave or come in voluntarily or at ease. You didn't have the freedom of travel here. Except there was resistance to that occupation. And so Israel, on a number of occasions, invaded. And you had cases in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2018, 2021, in which Israel invaded, and there were some Israeli soldiers killed, but a far greater number of Palestinians, mostly civilians, although Israel always disputes who's a civilian and who's a combatant, but far more Palestinians killed than Israelis. These regular incursions, and during that time, Gazans never invaded Israel. This was referred to as mowing the lawn in Israel. Every so often you have to go in and tidy things up, and so they had to mow the lawn. All of that took place before October 7th of 2023, when you did have an invasion by Hamas. Gaza is one thing, and then the West Bank is the other. That was also captured in 1967. In the 1949 to 67, that's that green area that says Palestine. That's the West Bank. Since 1967, Israel's occupied that territory and has increasingly permitted settlements of Israeli Jews to be established there, even though U.S. policy was against it. They keep settling that, and so in effect, the West Bank is starting to look like it is over on the right-hand side now. The Likud party, the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, has in its charter a desire to essentially control territory from the river to the sea. That's been a notion that's been associated with Hamas, but it's been the policy of the Likud party, and now Elise Stefanik says they should control all of that territory. That's what the Word of God gives them. So this is the occupation that Hamas resisted on October the 7th. They killed some 1,200 Israelis. Some hundreds were soldiers, but many more were Israeli civilians. And as much as the story is disputed, at least some of these killings were vicious killings. The International Court of Justice has issued arrest warrants for some Hamas officials. It may well be that they've been killed in the meantime, saying that they violated the international humanitarian laws of war. So this was a problem, but it's not the beginning of the story. It's part of the story, and it's a problem. And since then, we've had the Israeli assault on Gaza, and the numbers are hard to figure out. The official number still is 46,000. It's probably going to be much higher than that, since we're already discovering bodies under the rubble which hadn't been counted before. We have the issue of displacement. Almost the entire Gazan population has been forced out of their homes. Many of them, many times. So you've got the displacement. You've got a widespread destruction. The figures are changing. It's up to 92% of the structures in Gaza have been destroyed. Of those who weren't killed, you have some 4,500 amputations, and because medical supplies weren't permitted in, many of these amputations were carried out without anesthesia. You're going to have a generation of significant medical costs and psychological costs as a result of these injuries. These are one problem with this was done by the Israelis who did the attacks, but they were all done with American planes, which we gave them, and American bombs, which we kept supplying to them. We objected very often to their violating the laws of war, but we continued sending the weapons that made it necessary. The claim was, how can we say, we have the Christian tradition of confession. Do we just have to confess we're complicit in this sort of disaster? So why do we do this? Because we seem to really be committed. Well, we are really committed to Israel. And there's a number of reasons, of course. The history of Jewish victimhood is all too real. Pogroms and all kinds of acts of Semitism, the worst of which, obviously, is the Holocaust. 6 million killed, and we all, I think, know those stories in the sense of what's going to provide for security for Jews who have been suffering like this. Theodor Herzl said there's no hope for Jews in Europe. European anti-Semitism, and he made that argument before the Holocaust. We have to have our own state which provides security for us. So that's been a very powerful argument for a long time. The idea that we have shared values. Israel is a democracy, and they are a democracy. They have contested free and fair elections. They have a multi-party system. They have freedom of the press. If you read Haaretz has a freer press than the New York Times is, it seems to me. So there's no question it's a democracy in one sense, but is it a democracy for all of the people under their control? If you add up the numbers of people who are in Israel and in the West Bank and in Gaza, it's pretty close to equal numbers. And about half of them are living under what Ta-Nehisi Coates says is a state of apartheid, unequal political and legal rights for significant people. So is it democratic? Sort of, but in some really important ways, not so much. Or it's a strategic value. They're our closest ally in the United States. President Biden said in remarks shortly after this war has really gotten underway. Anyway, he says, I've learned a long time ago, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist. I'm a Zionist. He doesn't say he's a humanist. He doesn't say God so loved the world. He says, I'm a Zionist. Well, should our president be a Zionist? He's not our president anymore. Anyway, you've got the issue, and Joe Biden has been very outspoken in his Catholic background. He quoted St. Augustine in his inaugural address. But he takes a different teaching out of the Tanakh than Pope Francis does. Anyway, you've also got another reason for why we are so supportive of Israel. We have a very effective group called the Israel Lobby. It's not a group, it's a collection, a disorganized collection of groups. There's this book by Mearsheimer and Wald from 2006, I think it was, and they stress, of course, that the Israel Lobby is not a Jewish lobby. You have some Jews who are supportive of Israel, others who are critical of it. You have a lot of Christians who are very supportive of Israel. It's a mixed bag. People who lobby for Israel are part of this Israel lobby. Or this book from last year by Elon Pape and many others talk about the well-organized support of the state of Israel, first in Britain and then now in the United States as well. And we have a series of American officials visiting and speaking to AIPAC. And AIPAC here, this is one thing which says the AIPAC emerges as a moderate force in political primaries. The pro-Israel group has silenced skeptics after ousting Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. Bowman was a congressional representative from New York. Cori Bush was one from Missouri. Both of them were very critical of Israel, very supportive of the Palestinians. AIPAC organized or supported opponents and then funded them. They said they raised $100 million to support candidates who were in favor of Israel, and they won every election that they participated in. So an effective electoral strategy from AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Is one. So you've got that as a reason. They provide help for their friends. Here's the various money that pro-Israel groups have supplied U.S. senators from 1990 to 2024. And according to OpenSecrets.org, Joe Biden was sort of at the top of recipients of pro-Israel money. He hasn't been bought off. This is not corruption. This is acknowledging that Joe Biden is a fervent supporter of Israel. He just can't get himself, he couldn't get himself to cut off military aid to Israel, even when he disagreed with the tactics that they were pursuing. So you've got various groups who are very supportive of Israel in U.S. politics. Then you've got a number of opponents of Israel and advocates of universal human rights and civil rights. Progressive American Jews, the International Court of Justice, South Africa, the International Criminal Court, Jimmy Carter, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so on.
The suit brought by South Africa had particular importance because of South Africa's history in the anti-apartheid movement. The ancestor that they drew on in their case at the International Court of Justice at the end of 2023 was, of course, Nelson Mandela. And they looked at the issue of Israel and the Palestinians and in Gaza and the West Bank through the lens of their own experience, their own civil rights experience with apartheid. And so in their presentation, they mentioned for this reason, it is important to place the acts of genocide in the broader context of Israel's conduct towards the Palestinians during its 75-year-long apartheid, its 56-year belligerent occupation of Palestinian territory, and its 16-year-long blockade of Gaza, including the serious and ongoing violations of international law associated therewith, including grave breaches of the Fourth Geneva Convention and other war crimes and crimes against humanity. The accusation that Israel was not a democratic state, but was an apartheid state which severely restricted or denied political participation and legal recognition of virtually half of the people under its control was not a new one. It had been made some years ago in 2006 when former President Jimmy Carter published his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, which was a particularly controversial book at the time because of the allegation that Israel was an apartheid state. In fact, one of the members of his board not only resigned, but organized a group of fellow board members to resign in protest. They were on the board of Jimmy Carter's center in Georgia, and the Carter Center, and they resigned in protest of this. And although he later, some years later, this fellow Berman sent Jimmy Carter an apology, ending up agreeing with Carter's assessment. Having said that, others were not in the mood to hear about Israeli apartheid or what they considered to be meritless, counterproductive, and without fact claims of South Africa at the International Court of Justice. So we had a group of 210 congressional representatives denouncing what the South Africans were accusing Israel of at the International Court of Justice, and called on the Biden administration to take steps against the ICJ. You had the ruling of the ICJ coming in the beginning of 2024 on January 26th, in which they ruled that it is plausible that Israel has committed acts that violate the Genocide Convention, and they called upon Israel to take steps to prevent genocide. Now, the ICJ's case was a bit like our grand jury. It was not a trial itself. They did not decide that, in fact, Israel was committing genocide. They were looking to see if there was sufficient evidence to, in fact, go ahead and conduct such a trial, which would take a minimum of 2 or 3 years to conclude. So, so this was not a finding that Israel was guilty of this, but they said, okay, there's enough evidence. South Africa has made a sufficient case to say that we should go ahead with the trial. But that by itself was a groundbreaking finding by the ICJ. It was rejected by many in Congress and by the administration. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken denounced the fact that Israel was being referred to in the International Court of Justice for alleged genocide during its war in Gaza, and he repeated the argument, the claim that it was meritless and without any factual basis. Shortly after that, in May of 2024, the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court presented the argument that the ICC should issue warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and the Prime Minister of Israel, and Yoav Gallant, then the Minister of Defense in Israel, along with the Hamas leaders who had been guilty or accused of conducting the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel. For war crimes, and in his presentation, he accused Netanyahu and Gallant of a group of crimes against humanity and war crimes, including the starvation of civilians, the willfully causing of great suffering or serious injury to body or health of the Palestinians, willful killing, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, extermination, persecution, and other inhumane acts as crimes against humanity. He could not, of course, issue those warrants. He needed the ICC's judges to go ahead and approve his request. Again, the Biden administration rejected the ICC. Antony Blinken says the United States fundamentally rejects the announcement from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that he is applying for arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials, together with warrants for Hamas terrorists. We reject the prosecutor's equivalence of Israel with Hamas. It is shameful. So these two principal major international courts, one of them dealing with states, the other one dealing them with individuals, came to conclusions that the administration and American legislative leaders rejected. Tom Cotton, a senator from Arkansas, says that equating Israel's democratically elected leaders with the perpetrators of the worst attack on Jews since World War II shows what a farce the International Criminal Court is. Mr. Khan, the prosecutors, his kangaroo court has no jurisdiction in Israel to pursue these anti-Semitic and politically motivated charges. My colleagues and I look forward to making sure that neither Khan, his associates, nor their families will ever set foot in the United States. So he was calling on the U.S. to take steps not against Netanyahu and Gallant, but against the ICC. And other U.S. political leaders made similar arguments. Joe Biden himself said that the move was outrageous, and others were calling for there to be serious consequences if the ICC actually approved this. Here, the Congress here passed H.R. 23 in early January of 2025, in which it called on imposing sanctions on the International Criminal Court in its effort to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute any protected person in the United States and its allies, specifically in Israel. Yes, others did not just find it plausible that Israel was committing genocide or that its leaders should be arrested to face trials, supposedly, in the allegations of that. Two major human rights organizations concluded that, in fact, Israel was committing a genocide. The first one of these was Amnesty International, which in December of 2024 came to the conclusion that Israel was committing genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And again, the U.S. government, State Department spokesman, Vedant Patel, rejected Amnesty's finding. He says, we disagree with the conclusions of such a report. We have said previously and continue to find the allegations of genocide to be unfounded. Another organization, the Human Rights Watch organization, also found that Israel was guilty of acts of genocide. And again, Patel said that he rejected the finding that Israel was guilty of committing genocide, saying he said that when it comes to a determination of something like genocide, the legal standard is just incredibly high, and so the finding of this scenario we just disagree with. The specific way that the Human Rights Watch was quite specific in the what they were accusing Israel of doing, and that was to deny Israel sufficient water. They came up with their analysis of how much water was used in Israel per person, how much Israel permitted to be used in its occupied territory of Gaza, and that this was simply insufficient. Amnesty International had accused Israel of committing of starvation, as had the ICC prosecutor. And again, now you think of the tension between the one interpretation of the Exodus story and then the arguments regarding international law. And we talked about how in the plagues, according to the text, God denies the Egyptians water. The Nile rivers turned into blood and all the fish stank, and there was no source of water. So then you can draw from that that's in fact a tactic that God used, and then we can draw on that as well. Or you recall the hail beating down the crops, and then the locusts eating up whatever crops were remain. The denial of food. Foodstuffs to Egypt, and so a lack of water and a lack of food is accepted tactics if your cause is just. Now, that is a text from thousands of years ago. The argument is, well, humanity has moved on since then, and biblical interpretation has been made by some people that leaves that behind. And so we have the much more common reading of the Exodus story, and that God is makes that preferential option for the poor and the oppressed. So this is where interpretation becomes important. But if you take that hard line interpretation of the Bible and say that this is the Word of God, well then in fact which trumps which, and God's law or international law, and it seemed as though that Israel was drawing on its one interpretation of the Torah rather than how it has been interpreted by others within the Jewish and Christian and other traditions, and as well as the subsequent development of thinking about international law. Other organizations also made accusations against them. Al-Aq, which is an independent Palestinian non-governmental human rights organization in the West Bank, said that Israel was hiding its genocide by denying them, by a series of efforts to give the impression that they were in favor of human rights and ceasefires when they actually undermined them. So we had a series of findings that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocide, that its leaders should be arrested for trial facing those types of allegations, others saying that in fact they had committed genocide, the Pope saying that we should investigate whether or not there is a genocide. And this these were regarding Israeli leaders. Now, we want to also look at what the U.S. government, what the U.S. policy has been during that period, and the allegations against the United States. And so, first of all, what has been U.S. government support for Israel? Well, clearly it begins with domestic political support by the administration and by many in Congress. An example of unwavering U.S. support for Israel, and the argument is its complicity for what Israel was doing, came when Benjamin Netanyahu was invited for his fourth address to both houses of Congress, which he made in July of 2024. Now, this was after the ICC had issued the warrant for his arrest. And obviously, the United States did not take him and hand him over to the ICC, and instead they gave him the honor of addressing Congress for the fourth time. Winston Churchill had only been invited 3 times, so Netanyahu was that much of a greater recognized figure, and he got no less than 52 standing ovations during his 56-minute speech. So not only was he invited, but he was enthusiastically recognized here, and just as an indication of that, certainly what was, most important perhaps was the transfer of military aid to Israel since October of 2023. This was not new. The United States has been giving significant amounts of aid to Israel for many years. It's given Israel more aid than anybody else during the period from 1946 to 2024. Over $300 billion. As a rule, a little over $3 billion a year was given, but since the October 2023 period, the U.S. gave Israel first $18 billion in military aid to Israel, and then in January of 2025, the Department of State notified Congress of an additional $8 billion in arms transfers to Israel. And then when the Trump administration came into power on January 20th, it very quickly announced further additional arms transfers to Israel. Under the Biden administration, Biden very often did talk about the need for Israel to abide by international human rights law, and he called on the parties to have ceasefires. But in spite of that, when those things did not happen, he continued to send aid. So it looked as though he was either unable to persuade Israel, he wasn't willing to take the steps. He never seriously threatened a cutoff of aid or carried out a cutoff of aid unless Israel followed what he was saying he was in favor of regarding human rights policies that he thought Israel was lacking. And so it seemed as though the United States was actually complicit and was making possible the plausible genocide that was going on, or the genocide that was going on in Gaza. And then, of course, another sign of U.S. support was, in addition to military aid, was diplomatic cover, specifically in the United Nations. the Security Council is set, the United Nations, as you know, is set up so that in the Security Council there are 5 permanent members, of which one is the United States, and that if any one of the 5 permanent members vetoes a proposed resolution, that will defeat the resolution. So it's not uncommon to have a series of resolutions which are calling on Israel to stop its policies in Palestine. And then the vote is 14 in favor and 1 against, and the United States is the one against, and hence the the resolution does not pass. That matters because when you join the United Nations, you agree that resolutions that are passed by the Security Council are legally binding. It's a question, of course, could the UN actually enforce resolutions that are not followed? But that's another question. Anyway, there is U.S. diplomatic cover and the Security Council routinely in the United Nations, not just since 2023, but over the course of the last decades. That's not the case in the General Assembly, where resolutions critical of Israel pass with some regularity, and the United States votes against them. But there it is, a majority vote. It's one country, one vote, and the majority wins. And those resolutions routinely pass by large margins, and no one country has veto power. But the General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding, and so Israel can legally ignore them, and in fact they do ignore them. The people who protested against a U.S. policy within the United States very often said that that our support for the war on Gaza and our support or acquiescence in the face of settler violence, Israeli settler violence in the West Bank, had forgotten our own ancestors, and that we needed to recall our own ancestors. And you remember in Martin Luther King's speech, he said, "All we say to America," his Memphis speech, "all we say to America is be true to what you have said on paper." And Martin Luther King Jr. very often quoted founding American documents and said, "Here are some great principles, but you're not living up to them." And this was one of his themes. And so people who objected to what the United States was in fact doing said that what we were doing does not measure up to what we've said in the past, or even what President Biden was calling on Israel to respect here in current times. Obvious ones are here the Declaration of Independence, which refers to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. And they said instead we are complicit in the death of tens of thousands of people in Gaza. We had been acquiescent, even supportive, even before 2023, when Israel had essentially turned Gaza into an open air prison. It withdrew its settlements, but it controlled the entrance and exit into Gaza. And in fact, it was worse than a prison because it routinely, militarily, intervened in Gaza. Normally, the prison officials don't attack their prisoners, which is what happened. And instead of pursuit of happiness, that there was widespread despair that we were creating here in Palestine, and that UN General Assembly votes and world public opinion showed in general the vast majority were highly critical of Israeli policy and thought that the United States was being complicit in how it was supporting that policy, and so that we were not showing a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, but we essentially held the opinions of mankind in contempt. Or, you know, we have the preamble to the Constitution, which says that the one of the primary purposes of that document was that we, the people, could form not only a more perfect union, but could establish justice. And it just didn't look to an awful lot of people that our support for what looked like either ethnic cleansing or genocide or both was anything other than injustice. So we were forgetting our ancestors. Or somewhat more recently, we had quite rightly taken great pride in the world order that we were hoping to establish at the end of the Second World War. We, the United States, were very much in favor of the formation of international organizations, of the United Nations, of judicial procedures to resolve disputes, international law and international legal bodies, that we sought to draw on our own traditions, such as the Lieber Code, which goes back to our Civil War, as well as the Hague Agreements. Teddy Roosevelt had called for the second Hague Conference, and then the post-World War II Geneva Conventions, which sought to deal with the laws of war, how to treat prisoners of war, how to alleviate the sufferings caused by war, how to protect protected persons, such as prisoners of war and civilians, and that it seemed as though, of course, then this wasn't new to the post-2023, during our war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we seem to undermine that tradition by saying that the prisoners of war were different from the captured enemy combatants. That enemy combatants were not soldiers, terrorists were not part of regular armies, they were not covered by the war. We didn't seem to talk about how could we conduct war justly in the new age of war, which was not conventional warfare, guerrilla warfare, terrorism. How do you fight those types of wars fairly? Which is difficult, but instead we just seem to put that aside. And we were complicit when Israel was intentionally targeting disproportionate numbers of civilians in return for eliminating a very small number of terrorists. Were we undermining the very institutions that we had supported now for the entire post-World War II era, and pushing for something very differently, that now we were willing to tolerate excessive, disproportionate killing of civilians. And so over time, Israel had killed a lot more civilians, although the emphasis in news accounts very often was on those civilians in Israel who had been killed by Palestinians. But there was a wide disparity in the facts there. Regarding prisoners of war, there was great attention to the 250 or so hostages taken by Hamas on October the 7th of 2023, but less attention to the thousands of imprisoned administrative detainees who were held without charge in Israeli prisons. And so in general, there was the sense in which America was really forgetting its ancestors, forgetting the type of world order that we had wanted to create, and were returning to a very harsh period of traditional realism, of concentration on power politics, on balance of power politics, on the idea that it was as old as Thucydides, that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. This was not the world order that we had called on before, but it was the one that seemed to continue into the Trump administration, when he called for the voluntary movement, as he said, of the Gazans to Egypt, Jordan, Indonesia, perhaps other countries, but moving these peoples out of Gaza and saying that they did not have the right of return. And now others said that, of course, about 700,000, 750,000 Palestinians had been forced out of what is now Israel in the independence period of 1948, that about 200,000 of them had been displaced involuntarily into what is now the Gaza Strip, and that their children and grandchildren were those who were to be displaced again, and that this would be the second great ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And so it had become U.S. policy to support the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, that people had long argued that perhaps the goal of Israel had never been just to recover the hostages that Hamas had taken, and to deny Hamas the right to or the power to rule in Gaza after the war, that Hamas had to be eliminated, but that in fact that they wanted the complete takeover of Gaza, the ethnic cleansing, or if not that, even the genocide of the people of Gaza. And that when the newly confirmed Secretary of State Marco Rubio went to speak with Netanyahu, they talked about their support of President Trump's bold new plan to own or to have Gaza, that the United States would build a new Riviera right on the shore, and the Palestinians would be gone from the territory. So anyway, what does all this amount to regarding what is Ta-Nehisi Coates' message from the civil rights movement, both in the United States and in other countries, South Africa perhaps most noteworthy? What is the message there to Israel and to the United States? And then how do we here at Villanova respond to this message? How do we draw on the Villanova message? We care about Veritas Unitas Caritas. What is as true as we can know it now about this highly contentious topic? How can we draw on a variety of sources? That's the unitas, to unify, to synthesize, to integrate, to listen to a whole range of voices, all voices to the degree that's humanly possible. So we listen to Ta-Nehisi Coates and Martin Luther King, Pope Francis, a variety of Jewish thinkers, the International Court of Justice, the ICC, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and many others. To develop, we integrate all of those in order to see what seems to be as true as we can know. And we do that because we actually care about, and we want to care for everyone who is affected by our synthesis. That Caritas is the greatest of these three principles of Villanova education. So, what is the message that we take away from a serious consideration of all of these sources? How do we draw on all of them? And then where will we take the message that we develop in response to this? How will we, at the very least, publicly discuss it and not be silent in our considerations of the issue? After all, Joe Biden had said in October of 2023 that silence is complicity. And so we cannot remain silent, or we become complicit in what is going on there. What should we say about Israeli and U.S. policies here during the Biden and the beginning of the Trump administration? And what should we be doing? And those are the great questions that we are left with. And I think ultimately Ta-Nehisi Coates is calling on us to take a serious look at ourselves and what we've come from, what we aspire to, and what we seek to achieve if we live up to the best of our ancestors. Thank you.